Hello and welcome back to another Docker Compose tutorial. My name is Xander. Here we're going to be working towards a deployment of React and Django. I've tried to make this tutorial progressive. So first of all, we'll go for this setup here. So our web client being our browser will access React through the Nginx server. So that's how React will then be served back to the web client. And then from that point, React being on the web client, it can then access the API data through gunicorn over to our Django API service. And that's the first setup that we're going to aim for. So once we work through that setup, we'll then move across to configure Nginx to serve both React and Django. So here we're forward across any API data to gunicorn and then gather the data from Django in that way. So this setup here requires a little bit more Nginx configuration, and I am assuming that you may have absolutely no knowledge of Nginx or gunicorn. Maybe at this point, if you're not too sure what they are, by all means, just have a quick look online. You'll get the general idea just working through the tutorial, what it is, what it does, and I'm sure I'll drop in a little bit of information about them. So in order to complete this tutorial, I'm assuming maybe that you've looked through or worked through the previous tutorials in this series. If you're completely new to this Docker tutorial series, you are going to need Docker Compose installed. So because in this tutorial we are using React and Django, you are going to need Node and Python installed. And remember, I'm using a Windows client here. So I do have the React and Django API application available, so you'll be able to download that in the video description, and that's where we're going to start. So I'll go through downloading it, getting it started, and then we'll start to configure our Docker files. And then finally, I just wanted to note that this tutorial is about learning Docker and Docker Compose, so some of the approaches I take might not be considered as best practices. Or indeed, they might not be the most efficient way of performing the task. Again, I'm just trying to put the code all up front so we can clearly see the process and how everything is working. So I just tried to make it a little bit more visual for us. So finally then, before we start, we're going to be building two Docker files, one for React and one for Django, and then we build a Docker Compose file. We then need to configure our Nginx configuration file. And at that point, we can then serve task or part one of the tutorial. Then we need to go ahead again and then reconfigure Nginx file so that we can then serve or forward our API requests over to gunicorn. And then finally, bind mounts versus volume. So previously, what we've done so far is we've been using bind mounts. So we've been binding, say, the container or data in a container to our computer, and that enabled us to work from our Visual Studio Code editor, save all the files on our local machine, and then obviously they get updated as we update the files on our local machine to the container. So here we're going to look at bind mounts versus volume. So there's going to be an example of both here. So go ahead and download the repository that you'll find in this video description, the setup code. And once you've downloaded, we'll just go through setting this up. Now, if you're familiar with setting up Django and React, just head over to the next part where we get started. So let's just go through how to set this up. So I've downloaded it. We're going to need to extract it. What you're going to find is there's a new folder here. And what you can do at this point is just cut that out and put it here, right? So we don't want this long, title because that just ruins our command prompt. So we now have Django and React. So there's two folders here. We don't need this, right? So let's just get Django started first. So just open up Visual Studio Code. Okay, so let's go ahead and open a new folder. So I think it's on my desktop in D. So Django, select folder. And then we just need to, we don't need to in actual fact get this working, because remember, we're going to be running this in a container. But if you want to, it's probably worth going ahead and just checking to make sure this works, right? So let's just make a virtual environment for this, and then we'll just activate that. So again, if you're familiar with this, you can skip ahead here. Right, so py. Oh, okay, so we now need to pip install the requirements. So mine is our requirements. Okay, so the requirements are just here. So these are all the dependencies that are going to be needed in order to get this application working. So that might take a couple of seconds. There we go. So let's just see if this works, because there's no point Dockerizing it if it doesn't work, right? So it looks like it's started. So let's open this in the browser. So if you head over to the 127.0.0.1.8000, just a normal Django setup, and then go to API. Our API should be there, and you should see all the data. So that's pretty much all the data that we've got in our application, and that's going to be served to our React application. So let's get our React application working. So I'm going to create a new window here. So let's just go ahead and do that. So from there, I need to file, open folder, desktop, D, React, and then go into your blog API. Okay, so let's select this folder right here. Okay, so from here, what we can now do is just test to see if this is working again. So we're going to need to npm install. So that again is like running the Django requirements, so pip requirements. So the requirements are going to be here in the package JSON file. They're going to be needed to run this application. So here we're doing this simply just to double check that it's working correctly. Again, we don't want to containerize something and start something that doesn't actually work. And there may be a small issue. So let's just run this and see if it works. So once that's finished, just type in npm start, and you can see that's going to take you to the localhost 3000. A new browser will probably open, and you can see that the application is working. So we have 4 items in our API, and those are showing now on this home page here. So that's pretty much all we've got here. There's nothing to click on here. It's just a simple React API setup. So now we're going to containerize everything. So the idea here is that, yeah, we've got our application. Now we want to put it onto our server. So we need to prepare this with Docker so that we can then just migrate that across to our server using Docker containers. So let's now go ahead and complete the first step. So the first stage, we are first now going to create a Docker file for both React and Django. Yep, so let's start with Django. So we want to create a new file here called Dockerfile. So we're going to place a Docker file, like I've said, in React and Django, and then using the Docker compose file, we use the context just to point towards these files here. So our Docker file here. So first of all, we're going to need a platform for us to work on. So here we're going to have the Python 3.8 Alpine. So that's going to be running. And then we'll set the unbuffered to 1 so that all the information or the console command information isn't buffered and it goes straight to the terminal, as I've explained before. And then the working directory. So we're going to create a new directory in our container called Django, and we're going to basically install everything in there. So to do that, we're going to need our requirements file. So just make sure it's spelled correctly. And then we're going to copy across our requirements file over to our new working directory. And then of course we're going to need to pip install them. Right, so we'll go ahead and do that. And then last of all, we're just going to copy everything across. Right, so at this point, we probably need to set up a Docker ignore file. And that's something you can do. So a Docker ignore file is going to allow me to select what folders and files I don't want to include when I copy across. So let's just build one very quickly. So again, in our directory here, we can just create a new file, Docker ignore. And here, for example, we can just define the files and folders that we don't want to include when we copy across here. So that's Django sorted. Now we're going to copy everything across. Obviously, we've installed our requirements. We now have this containerized. So now back in React, let's build this. So I've created a new Docker file. This is in the main directory of our blog API React application here. So let's go ahead first of all and bring in an image. This is going to be Node. That's going to allow us to actually build this application. And then we'll go ahead and create a working directory in our container so that we can then copy across everything that we need and then do the run npm build. So if you're not familiar with React, you won't know that you need to, once you've completed your application and you want to serve it on a server, you need to run build. That's basically going to take all your files and folders and put them into a build folder so that they can then be served to the browser. So it's just a way of kind of collecting everything together, putting it into a folder so it then can be served in production. So what we want to do ultimately is to take that folder and make that accessible from our Nginx server, because we want the browser to send a signal to, which will be the server, the Nginx server, and then we want Nginx to know where this build is so it can then serve it back to the user. So that's important, an important step we'll go through in a minute when we start working with Docker Compose. So now we've done with the initial setup, the Docker files, we now need to create our Docker Compose file. So what I'm going to do here is go to File, Open Folder. I'm just going to go back a folder, right? So you know that I'm on the root directory. Okay, so that was React. I've now moved back, so we can now see the root directory here. We have Django, which is our back end, and React, which is our front end. So we're going to work from this directory now. So we're going to be utilizing Nginx. So let's just create a new folder here called Nginx. So that's going to be our web server folder where we're going to describe some of the settings or add some of the settings to Nginx. So let's just create a new file in here. Let's call this Nginx setup. That's going to be a conf file, configuration file. Okay, so we'll configure that shortly. So next up, we're going to need a Docker Compose file. So let's just do that. So docker compose.yaml. Okay, so this is our Docker Compose file. So let's get started building. So first of all, we want to set the version of Docker Compose we want to utilize, and then we'll start with the services. So here we have 3 services. We could call them Django, React, and Nginx if we wanted to, or just backend, front end. So I'm just going to describe this as backend, being Django, and then I'm going to set out the build. So the context. So this is just asking or telling Docker Compose where my Docker file is inside of my Django app here. So just for a little bit of context, and then I'm going to run this command. So you can see that I'm using gunicorn server. So I'm going to run core.wsgi. So how do I know where or what this is? So if I just go into Django, remember what we've done is we copied this whole thing across to our new Django folder over, say, in the container. So our container has a folder called Django. And inside of that, I'm saying basically there's an application here called core. This is my main application when I set up the project. And you can see there's a file here called WSGI. So that contains the settings in order to allow Gunicorn to serve my Django or our Django application. So that's that setup. And what we need to do, like we've done before in previous tutorials, is just bind an IP address and port so that it can be seen outside of the container. So 0000, think about it as all IP addresses, but port 8000. So we can attach our application to the outer, we can allow our application to be seen from outside of the Django container. Right, so we know Django works on port 8000 by default. So let's just go ahead, if we want to, map across our ports so that we can access this service from our computer, so 8000, and obviously Django inside of this container is working on port 8000. So that will allow us to access Django service. Right, so that's the back end sorted. So let's go ahead to the front end now. So we want the build again. Again, the context here is going to be dot, this time slash, if we go back up here, React, and then blog API. So that's where our Docker file is. So React/blog API. Okay, so now we're going to set up a volume. Right, so let's set up a volume. And this is where I stop a second. So far in the tutorials, we've been utilizing, as I alluded to, bind mount. So what we've been doing is we've been binding a container folder to our file system. And that way, anytime we change any files within our file system, it automatically updates the container and vice versa. So now what we're going to do is use a volume. Right, so it's persistent data. It will persist when the container is stopped or deleted, but this time it's stored, as it's suggesting here, in memory. So what's going to happen is that instead of it being stored somewhere we select on our file system, it's just going to be stored somewhere in our file system in a specific place defined within Docker. So this data, where it would normally defined or be kept in our file system using bind mount, it's just placed in a specific location that's defined. We can change the settings in Docker for this, but it would just be stored. It's suggesting here in memory, but I'm just going to say for now it's stored somewhere on a computer, and we will look at that shortly in this tutorial, where it is, how to access it, remove it, etc. So bind mount, put it somewhere where we might want to work with it. Volume, put data in a nice safe place so it can be utilized later. Now, the benefit of this, or one of the benefits, is that this data that we store using volumes, it can be accessed by multiple containers. So what we're going to do here, in actual fact, going back to our application, is we're going to set out a volume. And what we're going to do is we're going to put our, if you remember our React application, we need to build it, and all those build files need to be accessed by our web server, our Nginx web server. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a volume, and we're going to place our React build files inside of that volume, and then we're going to allow Nginx to actually hook into that folder with our React build files, therefore mapping across our React files over to Nginx. So then Nginx can then serve those files. That might sound a little bit complicated unnecessarily. So let's just have a go at doing this. So what we're going to do here then, we've got a build folder. So let's go and give it a name. So let's name this React build. So that's going to be the name of the volume that we want to create, and then basically we want to then put in the build information inside of that volume. Okay, so that would be /react/build. So where does that come from? So remember, what we've done in the Dockerfile is we have copied across everything over to a folder that we pre-built. We made a working directory called React, and then we copied across everything over. We didn't copy the blog API folder. Remember, we're inside of that. So we just copied all the files across. Now, when we do npm run build, that's going to make a new folder inside of this structure here. So going back here, we're going to be in that React folder we've created, and then inside that will be a build folder with all the React build files that we want to serve to the client. So that's that sorted. So let's go ahead now and run our Nginx service. So this is our Nginx. Right, so what do we want to do here? Well, first of all, we're going to need an image for this. So we're going to run this from the Nginx official image as a recording. Oh, well, we're just going to use the latest one, right? So whatever the latest one is, what we're going to do here is we're going to map port 80 to 8080. So Nginx is going to be running on 8080. And what we're going to do here is that anytime anyone requests a web page, typically that runs on port 80, right? So if you go to any website, that's going to be by default port 80. So what's going to happen here is that when anyone, let's just go back to our client here. So when a web client requests for any data, that's going to send a request on port 80 to our Nginx server. And what we're going to do here is basically translate that or send that across to port 8080 where Nginx is working. So hopefully that makes sense. So our data comes into Nginx from port 80, a normal web HTTP request, and then we send it across to port 8080, which is our Nginx service is running, and therefore we can then do something we can then do something with that data in Nginx, for example. Right, so with that in place, we now need to set up some volumes. Right, so volumes, and 2 volumes we're going to need here. So first of all, what we're going to do here is we're going to copy across our configuration file that we're going to build. So let's bring this down. So we're going to we built this configuration file here. So what we're going to need to do is, remember, dot is referring to this folder. Remember, we're working from here, this Docker Compose file. So dot slash and then the Nginx folder. And then inside of there, we've got Nginx dash setup.config. Okay, so we want to map that across to the server, because what we want to do is we want to potentially update the configuration files so that Nginx also includes our new configuration that we've set up here in this file. So the whole point here is we're just extending the configuration of Nginx through this Nginx setup configuration file here. So if you're completely new to Nginx, I think maybe like I've explained, is a web server package. It's going to handle our requests from users, from their browsers, HTTP requests, and it's going to perform some sort of action based upon the request that it receives. So at the moment, what Nginx is going to do is it's going to take our request from the web client on port 80. It's then going to take that data and move it into Nginx, port 8080, and then we can perform some action on it. The action is obviously going to be collect the React data and then send it back to the web client. That's what we want to perform, and that's what we want Nginx to do. So Nginx works, would you believe it or not, Nginx works when it loads up. It obviously runs on commands, scripts, which defines how to work, what to do, etc. So here, apologies for the bad explanation, this configuration file is basically going to extend the original configuration that Nginx has to run. So we want to add some additional instructions and commands, etc., so that it then performs some additional actions, in this case to serve our React application. Right, so what we're going to do here is we need to place it in the right place. So on the server or in our container, this setup file is going to be in the etc folder, and then Nginx. So we're kind of in the Nginx, the default Nginx image will have this folder structure. So our container will have this folder structure. So we're just following this Nginx, then conf.d, and then default. That's the default.config, and then the last parameter ro. So now we have a way of accessing our config file. What we can now do is, well, we want to also access our build, our React build that we've created. So here, remember, this is a volume, a named volume, which will now be storing, or will be storing, our React build application. And what we now want to do is make that available in Nginx. So what I want to do here is set up the other volume reference, so our named volume, React build. So I want to access that here in this component or this service. And basically I want to then store whatever's inside of that volume, the named volume React build, which is going to be the React build application or files. I want to store that now within my Nginx server. So var www, this is in the Nginx container. And then basically I want to go into the React folder, and then basically I want to put all of this data that's going to be served to the client here. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to make a volume. So let's initiate, say, a volume. Let's do this here, volume. So this is a named volume, which is going to be called React build. So what we're going to do here essentially is build our volume, our named volume. We're going to place the data that's inside of our React build that we built with our Docker file here inside of our volume. And then when we get down to the Nginx here, we're then basically going to have a look inside of that volume, take that data out and place it here within the Nginx folder structure, so it can then be served to the client. So we'll have a look at all these file directories shortly, but that's what's happening there. So hopefully that makes sense. So what we can also do is just add depends on, so the running order. So let's just set out the running order. There we go. So there we have it. So that's pretty much our Docker compose file now completed. So if there's anything there that you don't understand, please just ask a question. We'll see if we can answer it. That shouldn't be a problem at all, but hopefully I've explained enough for it to make sense. Right, okay, so now we need to set up Nginx to serve our React application. So let's go into our configuration file. So we're going to set up server. Inside of this, we're now going to set up some parameters that's going to essentially just connect to our React application, which is stored in the folder or file directory that we've set out right here in our volume. var www react. So remember, our volume is being, say, copied across over to var www react within our Nginx container. Right, so let's go in here. So first of all, we want to set the server, and you can change this, of course, but I'm going to set this to listen on 8080, right? So if you remember earlier in my Docker Compose here, I've mapped across port 80, so all the HTTP data that comes in from the client, it's going to be in port 80, and I'm mapping that across to port 8080, and that's where my Nginx server is going to be listening for any requests. So you can change those ports across, of course. There's no particular reason why I'm doing this at all. So 8080, and now we need to set a location. So this is a location for our React files. So here, location slash. So don't worry about the location bit, just slash bit. So here, if, for example, a client sends me a request from the root directory, so if they were just to type in my domain name, that's the root directory, that's going to be now captured here. That's the whole point of this. So if I had a folder called var and someone went to my website and typed in test.com/var, then this location will then pick this up right here. And the idea here is that we're basically matching those requests to this piece of instruction here that we're going to set up. So here's just going to be slash, and then under here we're going to say root slash var slash www react. So that's the folder, if you remember, that's on our Nginx server or container, which is holding the React application. So I'm just pointing it towards that. So anyone who makes a request to my server, utilizing my default domain name, whatever that might be, then they're going to basically be sent to here. And that's then going to serve the files back to the user, to the client. Okay, and that's pretty much it. That's how we're going to start. So that's now all set up. So what we're going to need to do now to get Docker working properly, let's just go over to, Django working properly, is we're going to need to add an additional requirement or installation here to the requirements text. So inside the requirements text, you can do this directly, of course, or you can just install it and recreate this file if you want to. But here, we're going to need gunicorn. So I'm just going to add that in here. So when this requirement file gets copied over by Docker, it will just install this as well. So that's the only additionality here in Django that we need to include. We need to have gunicorn package installed in order for us to use this server with Django. Okay, I think we're ready. So let's go ahead and now just open up our console. So I've gone back now into my other Visual Studio Code window where my Docker Compose file is, and I just want to make sure I'm running these commands in the correct directory. So the correct directory where my Docker Compose file is. That's important. So let's just remove all these files here. Move that down. So Docker Compose, right. So now what I want to run is Docker Compose and then build. So that is not going to work because there's a wrong compose file version, which is interesting. volume does not match any of the, oh, okay. I think I've made a typo here. Volumes, apologies. So at the end here, volumes. Okay, so let's go do that again. Okay, so now we have a problem. Volume must be mapping, not a string. Okay, apologies. So we're gonna need a comma there as well. So those are the two problems. So let's go ahead and now build. So once you've built or run the build command, you can now see we have two new images, the front end and the back end. So now we have that in place. We're now going to, let's just run docker compose up. Obviously what's going to happen now is going to run through our docker compose file. Everything is going to be set. We're going to create our Nginx. The image is going to be downloaded and set up, and that will also start all the containers as well. So let's give this a go. So running through that command, I did encounter a problem here. So let's just take a look at how to fix this. So this is just my old age. Going through the configuration file here in Docker Compose, I noticed that as I was talking to you, I just wrote what I actually spoke to you about. Config, obviously it's conf in the volumes here on line 20. That's in your Docker Compose file. So that's probably the error there. So let's try and compose up again and see if this works now. So it looks like that's worked. So it does look like we have another problem. The curly brace here was unexpected. So let's just close this down, Control C, and I tell you what, let's just go back and remove just manually through the Docker Compose, or sorry, the Docker app here. Just remove all the containers, go to the images. I realize it kind of, I can't make Docker Compose any smaller than this. And I'm working in a small window when I'm recording, so I do apologize. So I'm just going to go on the dots and remove my images. Let's just do this again. Let's just run through this one more time. So let's go for compose build. So it should be a little bit quicker this time, potentially, because we don't need to download the Nginx image. And we compose up, give this a go. So potentially this time everything is working much more effectively. So let's now go back into our browser and refresh, and there we go. So React is up, it's being served from our container. Notice that we're using port 80, so we're not specifying like we did in the React initial load. When we built it originally, we had to define 3000, like localhost 3000. So now we're actually running 127.0.0.1 using port 80. And of course that's being then sent across, and we've got all the Nginx information here, what's happening. So data comes in, and then of course it's then being, the server's listening on 8080. So the data is essentially then being passed over to Nginx here, and then we're dealing with that. And of course Nginx is then utilizing the configuration file here to now address that request from the server, or from the client, sorry. And then of course it's then this directory is mapped across, so therefore the request is now kind of landed in that folder, and of course then those files are then being served to the client. So let's just go ahead. Now I'm just going to be utilizing Docker Desktop again, because I'm presuming that you're doing exactly the same here at this point in time. So what we can do, if we go into our containers, open up our containers here, we can, for example, have a look. If we go into the CLI, so let's go into the Nginx CLI, that will open up a bash shell here, looks like. So from here I can type in ls. So that's the directory we're in. This is our working directory that we're working from. This is a directory that we've copied in our, remember we've got this var folder here. So so let's change directory to /var. So ls for list again. So you can see we now have this folder called www. So change directory www. And then we can list that again. Now we have this folder called React. Remember, this is the volume that we've created. So let's now go into that cd React, and you can now see that we have all the files. This is everything that's been built by React into this folder, and this is what's being then served to the client. So let's now go back here in our Visual Studio Code editor where our Docker Compose file is. So I've just closed the server, Control C. So let's go ahead now and have a look at Docker volume and where it's stored. So if I type in Docker and then volume and then ls, that's going to list all the volumes that are currently available. And you can see here I've got a volume here called React build, and that's a volume that I've created in my Docker Compose, and we're utilizing to basically store the React build and then to make that available here within the Nginx server. So what happens if I were to, for example, try and find that volume on my computer? Well, you can do that, of course. It's a little bit tricky. I'm going to make a new file here. So this will be in the repository. So let's just call this commands.txt. So this is where you're going to find it if you're running a Windows machine. So I'm going to copy that into a new window here. And this is where my volumes are. So you can see the React build. So one thing to recommend here is to not try and delete any of these folders directly, because if you delete this, there is a reference point in Docker that's referencing this volume here. So you're not actually deleting the volume, you're just deleting the folder, and then that's going to cause loads of problems. So don't go ahead and delete this. You can go in and have a look at the data. This is all the data that's needed. Again, this is the React build that we created. So that's all there. So let's just close that. If you did want to, for example, remove, then all you need to do is type in Docker volume and then rm for remove, and then just the name of the volume that you want to remove. So in this case, React build, for example. So that's going to remove it. So we don't want to remove it at this point. So let's go back to Compose up. Okay, so back to our server. So everything is now working. So just another thing to note here. Let's go back to F12. So let's just refresh the page. So notice here that, for example, our page, so we can test to see if how this is being served. So if I can try and find where I can drag this up. Okay, it's not playing. So you can see by looking through this information here, so I've selected, this is the request. So you can see going down, eventually it says the server. This is an Nginx server. So clearly this is being served from our Nginx server. So this is just ways of understanding what's happening here. So our API data, at the moment, our API data is being sent. And you can see here that when I hover over API, if you can see that on your screen, it says 127.0.0.1.8000. So that is still referencing the Django server as 8000 port, so directly referencing our Django server. And you can see here that this is being served by, let's have a look. So my eyes. This is being served by our WSGI server. So clearly that isn't at the moment being served from our Nginx server. So let's not forget our WSGI server is our gunicorn server. So at the moment we've now completed this. This is part one. Our web client is sending a request to our domain name. Nginx is picking that up and then obviously returning the React build to the web client. And then the user can then on the web client access the data. The data is being sent by additional request. Our API data is an additional request, and that's going through our gunicorn server and then picking up the data from our Django API. So what we want to do now is configure Nginx so that we can pass our API data over to Gunicorn and collect it from our Django API. So you may have this question: why would I use Nginx and Gunicorn here? Because I both said that they're both web servers, so they're just serving, they can do more, of course. They are serving the files. In this case, Nginx is serving React to the web client, serving those files. And then Gunicorn is serving the Django output to the web client? And I guess that is the answer. So Nginx can't necessarily work with Django directly. So Gunicorn was developed to do exactly that. So the reason why we use Gunicorn here, essentially, to break this down, is because it can work with Django to fulfill all the required steps in order to retrieve data and then to prepare it and get it ready to then send back to the web client. So that is what Gunicorn is going to be doing, or gunicorn is going to be doing, and why we need it. So Nginx can communicate with gunicorn, and gunicorn then communicates with Django, gets all the data back to then prepare to send back to Nginx to then send to the web client. So it's needed for exactly that, to be able to communicate directly with Django, whereas Nginx cannot do that. So this is the setup. So let's now go ahead and forward our API requests over to gunicorn so that they can be served by Django. So let's get back into our Nginx setup configuration. We'll just close the server. Right. So first of all, we're just going to define the server, really. So we can do that by setting an upstream. We're going to call that API. And then this is going to be server, the name, so backend. So that's the name here of our service called backend. So we're calling it there by name. And that's running on port 8000. That's our Django backend. Okay, so upstream API. Let's think of that as basically the name to this data. So think of that as a variable. API is the variable name, and this is the data, say. So that's a bad explanation, but it makes sense in a second, right? So we've set up our server. So now what we can do is we can now listen for these requests. So at the moment we've got our / which is referring to our root directory. So, sorry, location. This time the location is going to be /API. So our Django application, if we were just to run our Django application very quickly, I think I've stopped the service, but if we were to run, remember that our API data is collected from /API. So here we're basically just referring to that. So that's going to be the location that's going to be matched from the request. And basically now what we need to do is run a few different setups here. So proxy pass, and then HTTP. You can set this out in many different ways, of course, // and then we need to define where this data is. So that's just API. So this is a reference point back to the upstream here, which is defining the server. So we are building a proxy to our application. So that essentially means that any data that's designed for this API is just going to be forwarded across to our server. So that's what Nginx is going to provide us, this kind of proxy service. Any data is going to be sent across over to this new location, which is obviously our gunicorn server, which is obviously then connected to Django. So what the documentation tells us, and I just wanted to bring this in, the Nginx documentation, it tells us that we need to define two header fields, and that's the host and the connection. Right, so we've got the host here, and we just need to then, the host, sorry, and then the connection. So those are the two things that we've set up that are required in order to get this working. So we're just going for a default minimal setup. There are many other header aspects you might want to change, and obviously your needs will be different and they will develop as you go along. So with those two set up now, I think that's pretty much all that we need to do. So I'm just going to roll this back. I'm just going to delete all my containers. I'm just going to start all again. So I'll get rid of all my images, and then finally my last step will be to delete the volume. So to delete the volume, remember to remove dereact build. So that will remove the volume. Okay, so now we're just starting from scratch again. So there's a few things that we need to change. One of them is I've seen a typo here. So there needs to be a semicolon after the API there. So that's the first thing. Right, so now what we need to do is to go into React and our blog API, and then our src here, and I think it's the app. Yep, the app here. So you can see that we have this static path here to our API. So what we don't want to do now is obviously send 8000 because we want to use the port 80. We want to go through our Nginx server. So that is running on, we need to send that request on port 80. So let's go ahead and change this. So let's just remove 8000. There we go. So that's the request that we're now going to make. And obviously that's going to now be matched in our here in a location. And obviously now we're then going to send that across to our proxy server, well, to our Django server, sorry, which is going to be here utilizing the 8000 port. So we're just translating that across to our server. So let's now go ahead and rebuild everything. So remember, I've closed everything down. I've removed the volume using this command here, and now I'm just going to rebuild again. So I'll go through Docker compose build, give that a couple of seconds, and then I'll run the Docker compose up command. Okay, now Docker compose up. So everything comes up, and let's have a look. So let's go into our server. Okay, so we can see that we're running it from port 80, so that looks okay, and our data is being found. So let's just now go into this and have a look to see where our data is now being served. So in the network tab here, F12, network tab, you can see from my local host, I can see that this is being served. It's up here, sorry, from my Nginx. Okay, so that's React. So let's have a look at the data now. You can see here that the link is different. It now says 127.0.0.1/API. That's the first change we made. And then down here now you can see that if we move down somewhere here, it would tell us that it's being served from Nginx. Here we go, server, Nginx. So clearly now we're making that request for our Nginx server. So we can still access our server on the port, don't forget. So if we typed in here 8000/API, so that's still available because we made those ports available, remember, in our Docker files. So now we have this basic setup with the web client Nginx serving or proxying our Django server and serving our React application. So there we go. So thinking about what we want to achieve in this tutorial, hopefully it was useful. We've now kind of worked towards deploying React and Django. Of course, now we have this in place. We could now obviously deploy this onto our server with the same setup. So thank you for listening. Like I said, hopefully it was useful. Hopefully there was enough information there for you to start thinking about and working towards deploying React with Django. As per normal, if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. Maybe consider joining our growing community. And like always, hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.